guys, Jay here. Welcome to Eons of Battle. Games Workshop recently did me dirty. I've been working on putting together a very pretty Dark Eldar army, and very recently, this February, Games Workshop removed the Tantalus, the cool Forge World option, from the Dark Eldar range. They rug pulled me, and that got me thinking, this does feel like something that Games Workshop does kind of a lot. What is the actual timescale value of a Games Workshop kit? This led me down quite a rabbit hole. Games Workshop's a little bit of a weird company in that they actually keep their products available for sale for sometimes decades, which is pretty darn unusual. But with a game like Warhammer 40,000 where you do play it for years and years and years and years, like when you buy a model kit, can you expect that unit to kind of remain the same indefinitely? Well, I found some of the oldest kits that Games Workshop has ever made. If you bought these, if you excitedly purchased these at their original launch, you had a long time to spend with those minis being the coolest ways to play those units in the game. The ever popular Orc Boys had an 18-year lifespan starting out in 2007 and still currently available. Although there were some really cool new monopose orcs, those orcs don't come with every possible option you're able to build an Orcs Boy squad into, and so the original, I'm pretty sure Jazz Goodwin sculpted orcs are still available on the Games Workshop web store. Another interesting example is the Termagants, initially released in plastic in 2001. Recently, they got a lovely new plastic upgrade, but they had 24 years of loyal service to the world of Warhammer. The Eldar Wave Serpent, initially released in 1998 and having a slight plastic upgrade in 2005, it is currently still being sold by Games Workshop, and so if you bought a Wave Serpent, if you were super excited waiting in line to be the first person to have a plastic Wave Serpent, you got 27 years out of your plastic kit. That's pretty darn good. Ghazghkull Thraka is a very interesting unit that has always existed in Warhammer 40,000, with its first model sculpted in 1992, but then it got replaced in 2000 with a metal model that eventually became a Finecast model. And then in 2020, we now have the modern Ghazghkull Thraka sculpt. Every single time it got remade, it quadrupled in size. The new Ghazghkull is enormous. And Ahriman is a really interesting miniature. Originally sculpted in 1996, it existed for 20 years, then got an update in 2016 for 7th edition. The original sculpt was so unbelievably good that the plastic refresh is like exactly the same. Like weirdly exactly the same. Like the proportions have been updated and some things are a little bit different. The two tassels that hang off of his robes are a little bit smaller and better, but it's almost a shot-for-shot remake of the original sculpt, which can't be said for Ghazghkull Thraka. That guy changed a lot every single time he got an update. A lot of kits from Games Workshop have had really, really long lifespans in the game. Things get a little bit wonky when you get Forge World involved. Forge World, which technically no longer exists, it's all been rolled into the just Warhammer brand. Forge World was the weird offshoot of Games Workshop where they would just kind of make whatever, and it would technically be part of the game, but technically not be part of the game. And so things would come and go, and some things have existed for decades and decades and decades, and some things had a really, really small lifespan. For the Drukhari, the Dark Eldar, as they were called back in the Dizay, they got two kits in 2011, the Dark Reaper and the Tantalus. The Dark Reaper died a couple of years ago and only lasted 13 years in service, and the Tantalus, my beloved Tantalus, lasted 14 years, getting discontinued technically as of right this second. It is still available to purchase from the Games Workshop web store, but it has been axed from the game, and so it lasted 14 years. I believe the shortest lifespan of a Forge World item was the Tyranid Dimacurion, which lasted only 11 years. I still remember fresh in my mind the Dimacurion, which is almost impossible to say, getting released on the Games Workshop web store. Just dropping out of nowhere, being available to purchase. And then like before I even blinked, it was gone. I've seen a couple of those things in person. It's a pretty big, interesting kit, but Forge World is weird. There's never been a Forge World unit that was inside of a Games Workshop codex. They've always been kind of a weird side project for Games Workshop. And so it's always been a little iffy if things are gonna stick around. I assumed that every single faction was gonna keep one big, expensive, cool thing. And that does seem to be the rule for Games Workshop. Obviously the Space Marines have the Thunderhawk gunship, the Orcs have the Gargantuan Squigoth. The Dark Eldar had the Tantalus, but the Tantalus went away. So I don't know if that's just something unique for the Dark Eldar that we don't get to have our fun toy, or if Forge World is officially going to be removed from the Games Workshop catalog. Probably not, because Forge World is still producing tons and tons of stuff for Necromunda and 30K, but it seems like they're maybe getting out of the 40K game. 40K might be getting out of the Cool Things game, but you know what'll never get out of the Cool Things game? That's right, EonsOfBattle.com. EonsOfBattle.com is the place to find our merch, like the Nick and J dice. Just so you know, the J dice tend to roll a little bit better than the Nick dice, and is the best way to support us doing what we do with a membership. Each month, members can get a credit that they can use on our new monthly terrain packs or any previous pack we have ever made. For the month of February, we made the Grim Battlefield basing bits, and we're making them for real, available as physical printed packs or as digital STLs. These Grim bits are the perfect thing for your dark miniatures to stand on. War-torn scenery isn't as easy to pull off as texture paste and the grass tuff, but with these kits, it's easy to give your minis the grim dark treatment. With a selection of sandbag and barbed wire barriers, ruined walls, smashed stained glass, unexploded ordnances, and more. All sized perfectly to complement any size of miniature, from giving an upgrade to your small rank and file troopers, all the way up to big chunks of debris for filling up monster and vehicle bases, you can do it with the Grim Battlefield basing bits. There are many more examples of kits from Games Workshop that have lasted a very, very long time. The Aspect Warriors just recently got new plastic sculpts, but those old pewter and fine cast miniatures have been kicking around for decades and decades. The weird thing about it is you almost can't focus on the dates, because that's only for people who bought those kits on release, and they're getting the most possible time investment out of their purchase. But all of these kits are still available from Games Workshop, so if you bought a kit today that has existed for years and years and years, it's a little bit up in the air how long you're gonna get to play with that kit as is before it's either replaced with a newer, shinier kit that you might want a little bit more, or more upsettingly, drop from the game. I kind of got rug pulled with the Tantalus, but that's kind of a little bit understandable because Forge World is so weird, and Forge World units tend to be really bad in Warhammer 40,000. They're more purchased for the experience and the collecting aspect of 40K, more so than the gaming aspect. It would be really, really frustrating if something existed for the game that like you wanted a lot of, you wanted to spam them because they're so good or they're such an important part of your personal army, but then get removed from the game. And that is a little bit what's happening with Space Marines. Space Marines are kind of a disaster. We all know the term range refresh. We're all begging for our own unique faction of 40K minis to get a range refresh, because it means that even if we already have some minis, there's some really, really cool new minis to buy that kind of just complement what you already own. You can keep using the minis that you already have, but there is a newer, shinier option available if you want it. Space Marines kind of got missed with this treatment. They're getting a range replacement, and that is the Primarisification of the Space Marines. I really, really like Primaris Space Marines. I think they look beautiful, are really, really fun to put together. There's still tons and tons of opportunity for kit bash and conversion, and Primaris Marines are coming out right now, where the classic squatty Space Marines were available like throughout my high school Warhammer career. And so even though I have a massive collection of old school Space Marines, I don't super mind Primaris because now I'm an adult with adult money and I can buy kits. And I've gotten so much better at building and painting Warhammer that I like having, the same challenges that I had in high school of putting together a Black Templar army, but I get to do it now with all of my new experience. But that's not true for everyone. The last time the old squatty Marines got a lot of love from Games Workshop was like 2013, 14, 15, and 16. That is when a lot of the old squatty Space Marines kind of got finalized. One of those kits is no longer available from Games Workshop, Blood Angels Tactical Marines. I don't know when they left the Games Workshop store, but I want to say it was either 8th or 9th edition Warhammer, where those kits were no longer available to purchase. You kind of just had to go with Primaris Intercessor Space Marines. And a bunch of those kits are kind of in the danger zone. The Space Marine Storm Talon gunship, Devastator squads, the old Tactical Marine box, and my personal favorite Space Marine unit of all time, Centurion Warsuits, all came out in this time period and are still technically a part of the game. You can purchase these things and play them in games of Warhammer 40,000, but I think they're in the danger zone. When Primaris came out, they didn't replace any previous kits. They were in addition to the old kits. However, a lot of those old kits are starting to go away. Some of the oldest kits, like the Storm Speeders and the old school Scouts, are already completely gone. They left at the beginning of 10th edition, but some of the hangers on I still think are something worth worrying about. If you bought a squad of Devastator Marines today, I don't know if you should hold out that much hope on those Devastator Marines existing for that much longer. Now, there's kind of two schools of thought behind this. There's Games Workshop is super greedy, and Games Workshop wants to make cool models. And every single time I think about Games Workshop, I see it both ways. Obviously, the Space Marines are Games Workshop's top sellers, and they want them to be as cool and awesome as possible. And so I think Primaris is a really good way of doing that, to not only just replace the old kits, but to kind of perfect them. There's definitely some flaws with the old Space Marine range where every single Space Marine was the exact same dude, and then there were Dreadnoughts and Rhinos. That's not necessarily enough to make something really cool. And so I appreciate like Gravis armor and Inceptor Marines and all of these new ways where you can kind of tech your Space Marines into whatever you want, but it is very different from old school Space Marines. And there's another little conspiracy that may or may not be true, where Games Workshop makes the old minis have bad rules. A very good example of this would be Devastator Space Marines. Right now, in 40k 10th edition, Devastator Space Marines are pretty darn lackluster. They don't really have very interesting rules, their points costs are kinda high, there's not a lot of incentive to take Tactical Marines and Devastator Space Marines in your 40k armies. This would make a lot of sense if Games Workshop wants to eventually eliminate those kits and stop selling them. And so if they just kind of make them not that viable in their game, people will stop buying them and maybe it'll soften the blow when those things get moved into Legends. But there are other examples where it is the complete opposite. In the Dark Eldar right now, two of the best units in the Index, the Beastmaster and Court of the Archon, and maybe Grotesques, they're so good. Like they're almost auto-include in a Dark Eldar army, and Games Workshop doesn't currently sell miniatures for those units. I think it's the only example of that in Warhammer 40,000, but like Games Workshop always sells kits to go along with the rules. But for Dark Eldar right now, some of the best things you can take in the game, and if the game is trying to push you into purchasing more models, they're doing a really good job for things that don't actually exist as purchasable models. And so, that's an example of the conspiracy not working. Maybe Games Workshop is just trying a little bit harder to sell Space Marines than they are trying to sell Dark Eldar, but I don't know, I can see it both ways. I tried to hunt down some rhyme or reason behind how Games Workshop makes its decisions on what stays and what goes, what units exist for 10 years, what units exist for 20 years, what units will always exist in the history of Warhammer 40,000, and there really isn't one. I think at the end of the day, Games Workshop is just a game company that is trying to make a game, and they're doing their best, to make a whole bunch of money, but there's no way of knowing for sure. I would say Forge Rolled is, if you're buying Forge Rolled, you're buying it to really look good on your shelf and for the fun of putting that model together and painting it. Forge Rolled, you just can't expect it to last forever in the game. Some things you maybe can, like if you buy a Warlord Titan, Games Workshop's probably always gonna update the rules for the Warlord Titan, but the Gargantuan Squigoth, that might be on the chopping block. Similarly with Squatty Space Marines, I think some of the vehicles will probably stick around a little bit longer because those don't have squatty Marines attached to them, and so they could just be piloted by Primaris Space Marines. But I'm really, really nervous about the Centurion warsuits. The Space Marine is so hidden inside, but it's still an old squatty Space Marine kit that is a little bit superseded by things like Terminators and Space Marines wearing Gravis armor. And the rules are, they're right on the cusp of being good or bad. They're kind of just meh. And so, I don't know, I really don't want those models to ever go away. They're like my favorite thing ever. I own 6 of them and they're an absolute nightmare to put together. And I magnetized every single weapon option. I kind of want 6 more. It'd be a really silly investment and it could potentially not be in the game forever, but it's just one of my favorite models of all time. I love them. I think old squatty Space Marines are definitely in the danger zone. We haven't even talked about Deathwatch yet. Deathwatch also came out in 2017 with Deathwatch Overkill. A lot of those models, that was the last wave of old school Space Marines. The Deathwatch, what are they called? Deathwatch Veterans kit? I think when they launched, they weren't called the Deathwatch Veterans, but they're now called the Deathwatch Veterans. Those are suits of Mark 7 Errant armor, which kind of dates back to the Horus Heresy, but it was the last time that squatty Space Marines were ever made. And funnily enough, they're like a half a head taller than old school Tactical Marines, but they're still a head shorter than Primaris Marines. Those models, I actually thought that they were going to get discontinued when, at the launch of 10th edition, it was a little shaky if the Deathwatch were going to be a thing or not. And then they got rolled into the Agents of the Imperium Codex. And so then I thought that they were gone. But then Games Workshop walked it back a little bit, giving them some more free rules and some index rules. And so it just leads to the confusion. I have no idea what Games Workshop is up to, but I think any modern kit is gonna have some good, strong legs to stand on. All of the new Eldar stuff, all of the new Necron stuff, all of the new Space Marine stuff, I think is a pretty safe investment in your hobby. Obviously, toys aren't an investment, but an investment in playing the game of Warhammer. I think the newer kits are a better investment than the older kits. Let me know in the comments below, what do you think of Games Workshop and the way that they handle their miniatures? It's very weird, it's very confusing, it can be very frustrating at times. I'm still really, really salty about the Tantalus, but other than that, I couldn't find any incredibly egregious examples of Games Workshop killing stuff, except for Squatty Space Marines. Squatty Space Marines are a bad one. Don't buy Devastator Space Marines right now. Please do not do it. Don't buy Tactical Marines either. The Storm Speeder is left at the beginning of 10th edition. The time of the old squat Space Marine is over, and it's now the time of the Primaris Marine. Thanks for watching.